Okay, good morning. We are in the book of Genesis. We have been in a series since the beginning of the year, grasping from these first three chapters of Genesis the reason why the world is the way it is, the reason why we are who we are, what we are, and answers to the questions that our age has begun to get to ask and to need clarity on. And so that's why we have been going back to Genesis 1 through 3. And we have spent several weeks in these chapters because they are so rich for giving us not only a compass for the world that we live in, but a foundation that is secure, that allows us to stand on firm ground in times when there seem to be more questions than answers. This week, we are going to be dealing with the seventh day. So we heard from Genesis 2, 1 through 3, where God describes the seventh day. Last week, we spent time looking at the sixth day as presented in Genesis chapter 2. So we're going back a few verses, but chronologically, we're going from the sixth day to the seventh day. And last week, we saw how Eden, this place that God made us to live, describes the longings of our heart, right? That we were made for a world where God would dwell with us, where we would reign, or where we'd experience His good reign, where we would enjoy work, and our relationships would be rich. And so we know that we were made for a world that we are living outside of. As we come into the seventh day, we introduce the subject of time. The subject of time. And we are going to learn today the reason why our time matters. I think that's maybe one of the parts of growing up, maybe the least fun parts of growing up, is when you finally become aware of time and how things take time and how there never seems to be enough time and how you have to wait for the time for the things that you want to do. We live in a world that, in the kind of the competing worldview that we encounter in our culture of naturalism, it doesn't really have an answer for our time. It tells us that we are the product of chance. We are the kind of the accidental coincidence of nothing coming before us, and that in the end there is nothing. And so the whole idea of finding our time matters when we are in these two giant oceans of nothingness on both sides of us really makes time irrelevant, right? But then that doesn't fit, once again, with how we see the world, how we see our life. We all struggle with time. We all recognize that time is this most precious commodity. Right? It's expressed in that secular statement of YOLO, right? You only live once, which is this idea that let's make sure we make the most of our spin here because time is precious. Time is limited. I kind of came to an awakening of the preciousness of time when I started my first career as an engineer. And I went from being a college student, that had kind of a very independent schedule and summers. I didn't know how great summers were until I started a job, and those are gone. But the way that the employee handbook worked was that a new employee couldn't take any vacation for like the first 6 months or something. So like you had no days off. Well, there was like some March of Dimes fundraiser that came up, and one of the things that you could buy was vacation time. This little auction. And I spent on that auction, I kid you not, more than my time was worth to buy myself a day off. It probably didn't communicate the ethos of a hard worker that the boss wanted to see, but I would rather give up money for a couple days to have another day off than to earn that money. And I did end up winning the vacation days. But time is precious. And I would suggest that everybody in this room is feeling the pressure of time about something. Either something that's due, something that has to be done, something that you can't do anymore. We feel the pressure of time, and we are racked with these questions. How do we use our time wisely? How do we make the most of our time? How do we enjoy our time? How will our time be remembered? Right? And as we think about these questions of time, there is no better place outside of the Bible than to go to the great sage Gandalf from the Lord of the Rings, who speaks a profound word to us as he is speaking to Frodo, the ring bearer, who is talking about the weight of the pressure of time that is upon him, that he has this huge task. And he says as in a lament, like, I wish this wasn't my time. And Gandalf wisely looks at him and explains something that I think is a word for all people as they deal with time. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. Now, there is something very different about the way Gandalf conceives time and a lot of the questions I just raised about what we do with our time. Do you recognize the difference? I said our time. Gandalf recognizes that time is given. Time is given. And when we recognize the perspective of time not being our time, but being given time, we enter into the worldview of the seventh day. And we recognize something fundamentally different about what is the good use of time when we recognize that our time is given. The seventh day is going to provide the answer of what do we do with time? How do we understand time? What is the right use of time? Because it tells us that time has been given to center us on God. Time has been given to center us on God. When the Apostle Paul was preaching the gospel to the town of Athens and was going back to the very beginning, he made this statement about our situation as being created by God. And he says, God made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way toward him and find him. Do you see what Paul is trying to make clear to a lost pagan country, a pagan worldview? He is trying to make clear that your time has been given. It has been allotted. It has underneath it a purpose. All of our time is filled with the purpose of knowing God, of being centered on God. And we find where Paul gets that when we study the seventh day of creation. So the guiding question that we're going to go through today as we grapple with this question of time is, how does the seventh day make our time God-centered? How has God given us the seventh day so that our time is God-centered? So we're going to look at three elements of the time that we have been given to understand what makes it God-centered. The first thing that we grasp as we look at the seventh day is that time is given to work. Time is given to work. As you read Genesis 1 and 2, as you read these 7 days of creation, you realize that the lordship of time is a major aspect of God's creation. Day 1, God creates light. That's the beginning of time. Then day 4, God creates the sun and the moon and the stars and assigns them the role of being timekeepers. And then finally, day 7 is a day entirely devoted to the time of rest. As you recognize 7 days, 3 of them focused almost entirely on the subject of time. Creation narrative teaches us this: time belongs to God. Time belongs to God. It is created by God, it is structured by God, and it is put in place to be in service to Him. When David writes of his existence in Psalm 139, verse 16, he grasps this lordship of time in God when he says, "Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them." You see, David recognizes that time belongs to God. And when we recognize that time belongs to God, we have to recognize that our lives are not about the time that we have, but that our time is a stewardship of God's time. As I think about this, I think there is a statement that may reorganize our minds a bit when it comes to time. And it is this: it is not us who give days to God, but God who gives days to us. Does that restructure how you think about your time? You're not being generous giving a day to God. God already gave you this day to give to Him, right? The way that we have to understand our time when we recognize that time belongs to God is it is not us who give days to God as if they're ours to decide how we want to spend them, what we want to do with them, how we want to fill them. No, it is God who gives days to us. And so the guiding principle of what do we do with our time is, what does God ask of our time? And what does God ask of our time? What are we supposed to do with our time? The narrative of creation, these 7 days, is God showing us how our time is to be spent. 6 days in work and then 1 day of rest. When Moses gave the 10 Commandments, we are given the commentary of these 6 days of creation as it interacts with our daily lives. And in the 4th commandment, we're told this: 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. You see, God says that He created the world in this structure of 6 days and 1 day of rest to be the pattern that we are to follow in our days. We are to be workers and resters, because that is how God has structured time. Now, God structured it so that 6 days of our week would be given to work. And it's surprising how much the subject of work has come up in the last few weeks as we have gone through the creation story. But work is very much a key teaching that we find in creation. And we need to make sure that we don't bring into the word work, as we find it in Genesis 1 and 2, the experiences and maybe the drudgery that we have with work now that we are several days downstream of these events. We live in a work outside of the garden where work is hard, where work is often unfulfilling. But we need to know that when God talks about 6 days of work, He is talking about that work that we saw last week was fun and fulfilling and flourishing. right? That's what God made us to do for 6 days a week, to do work that is fulfilling, work that is flourishing. And it is work that imitates God. I think it's fascinating that in this commandment on work, God uses the same Hebrew word for our work that he uses for his work in creation. It's the exact same word. And so the commentator, Franz Delitzsch, describes the significance of that when he says, when the name work is given to God 6 days of creation, human work is ennobled to the highest conceivable degree as being the copy of his model. You see, work has been given to us that was intended to be fun, fulfilling, and flourishing, and it was work that was meant to image and reflect our Creator, to be as noble as that, because we are given the same word to describe it. So, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us something very important about these 6 days and what we are supposed to do with them, and more specifically, how we are to work in them. Here's what we should know at this point. Because work is on God's time, it is to be God-centered, right? These 6 days of work, they're not your employer's time. They're not your time that you've contracted to give to this person. They are fundamentally God's time that God has given you to work for 6 days. And so at the heart of our work should be being God-centered about them. And what does that mean? If we turn to the book of Colossians, Paul helps us see what a God-centered work ethic looks like. In Colossians chapter 3, verses 23 through 24, he says this, "Whatever you do, work heartily, as for the Lord and not for men. You are serving the Lord Christ." So Paul is here describing what it means to be God-centered in our work. He gives us really in this passage 2 attributes of God-centered work. These are what should be descriptive of us when we recognize that our time of work has been given by God and belongs to God. What are these 2 attributes of God-centered work? The first is quality. The first is quality. God-centered work demands quality in our work. What was the quality of God's work? At the end of his creation, he said, good enough for the government, right? That was my phrase in engineering. You stop the job when the government would accept the work. But that's not where God stops his work of creation. He stops his work of creation at the highest level of quality. He stops at creation only when he sees all that he has done, all the work that he has given to creation, and says of it, it is very good. And so God demonstrates that God work is very good work. God-centered work seeks to do work that is very good. The whole idea of our work then on these 6 days is not just to get through it, not just to get our paycheck, not just to get the boss off our backs, but to work in such a way that the company men around us, the people around us, can perhaps capture a sense of your Father in heaven's work and the work ethic that he has, that you are seeking to imitate. You see, it would be most glorifying to God for the world to look at our work and say, that's not like the work of all these people who are giving me their time, right? And so I think the question, as we seek to be God-centered in our work, is, are we doing very good work? Are we working out of the worldview of our time belongs to God? Or are we working out of the worldview that it's my time and I give it away begrudgingly? Can we say at the end of our week of work, I gave my best? I gave my best. You see, when we recognize that our ultimate employer is the Lord, then the desire ought to be the very best. But we lose sight of that. When our work ceases to be God-centered, and we don't necessarily leave our work as the very best. The second attribute that we capture here is integrity. The second attribute of God-centered work is integrity. A little earlier in Paul's words to the Colossians, he talks about the work that is done for eye service, right? The work that you do because the manager is walking the floor versus the work that you do when the manager left early. Does your work change, right? The idea of eye service affecting the quality or the integrity of our work. And it reminds me of my engineering days where every Monday by 9 a.m. you had to turn in your timesheet. A signed piece of paper that testifies to how you can bill these 40 hours from last week to some project, right? And all of these 40 hours, they need to be billed to somebody who's giving us money. Otherwise, we're losing money. The idea that your work was overhead was, you don't bill overhead. Everything goes to a project. And that was the hardest 45 minutes of my week. Because as I would review my last week, I would say, well, how do I bill talking about sports? How do I bill 45 minutes every morning drinking coffee? How do I bill stretching lunch to 90 minutes? How do I bill all these things? The only way you do it is you lie. You bill it, you say, well, yeah, that's all in the company, and you sign it. And it's the accepted lie in the workplace. Because I would always tell my manager, I'm like, I just don't, can I put down a couple overhead hours? No, you can't put down overhead hours. And so there is this issue of integrity. When we look at how we spend our time, there's not this funny math about this when it comes to what the Bible says. The Bible doesn't have the same kind of, we all, don't exactly give a good hour all the time. The Bible actually has a very clear word for what it means to ask for payment for something you didn't actually deliver. You know what that word is? Stealing. Stealing. J.I. Packer, in his commentary on the Ten Commandments, convicts me when he says these words: theft of time, perhaps the commonest form of theft today. We start late, finish early, stretch coffee, lunch, breaks, and waste time in between. This, he says, is theft. This is theft. And so when we recognize this, I'm charged. I'm a thief. I have stolen not a little, but a lot, right? I am guilty because my work so often lacks the integrity that God-centered work should demonstrate. You see, God-centered work should demonstrate an honest day's work where you did what you said you were going to do and you did it well. That's what we do when it's God-centered work. But when we feel like there is this tension between, I don't want my hours given to this employer, I would rather have this hour for ESPN and fantasy football, we are not God-centered in our time. And so this is the tension for us. When our work is God-centered, it is in God. It is for God. And the way that we evaluate its quality is by God's standards and by God's judgment. So who is your work centered on? Who is your work centered on? Is it centered on God? Or is it centered on you? The second answer to how does the seventh day make our time God-centered is that time is given to rest. And here we come to, finally God and I say something that I can really get on board with. A day off. Thank you, God, for giving me a day off, right? Because, man, do we need a day off. We need a day for fun. We need a day for our hobbies. We need a day for rest. We need a me day, right? We need a me day. So as we look at the seventh commandment, we need to start with a question as we seek to be God-centered in our time. And that's this. When you think of your day off, who does your day off belong to? Who does your day off belong to? The story of Genesis 2 describes this seventh day. And it's kind of bizarre because if you look at the seventh day, nothing is done on the seventh day. Nothing is made on the seventh day. Nothing is accomplished on the seventh day. It is literally a day where God doesn't do anything but rest. So why did he make all these Hebrew scribes write more Hebrew words, which is some of the hardest work I have ever done, if there's nothing there that he does, right? The reality is that the seventh day is given to us as the climax of the story. The climax of creation is not that man is created, that man bears his image, that man is commissioned to rule the creation, that man is given the charge to be fruitful and multiply. All of that is actually exceeded and superseded by the fact that God adds a seventh day. The seventh day is the preeminent day because it is the last day. And what it means is that the climax of the story of creation is not us. It's God's rest. It's God's rest. The creation narrative does not ultimately put its focus on the creation, but it focuses on the Creator. That's what the seventh day is for. Now, when it says that God rested, does not mean that God was tired. The reason that he rested is he had literally nothing left to do. He was finished. And so his day of rest is to mark that he has done all that he needed to do the work of creation and to do it very good, and therefore he is finished. And it is time for him to rest. Now, the rest that God takes is a royal rest. When it describes God as resting, it is describing God as finally taking his chair, sitting down, and enjoying his creation. Now, when the Creator sits down, his chair has a special name. It's a throne, right? So God's rest is actually his enthronement over his perfectly done creation, where he is enjoying it and ruling it. When God sits on the seventh day, he is placing himself before his creation as its Lord, and as worthy of its praise. So that's what's happening on the seventh day. And it's that day that God has given us for rest. That's our rest day. But because rest is on God's time, our rest is to be God-centered, right? And so what is the rest that we are supposed to have? Well, as Genesis 2 verse 2 says, that God blessed this day. God blessed this day that he rested on. And this is the only day that God has blessed, a day in itself God has blessed. There is something about this day that is special, that has God's blessing. I like how Dan Allender describes the seventh day. He says, each day, at best, is a repetition of the day before, unless the next day is the Sabbath. It is the queen of all days, the days in which division, destitution, and death are set aside to celebrate our union with God, the abundance of his love, and the wild hope of the coming kingdom. You see, this day of rest is more than just a day off. It is a day of celebration. It is a day of rich blessing. And we have lost some of the richness of the word blessing when we just put it on a bumper sticker or when we bless people's little hearts. But when God uses the word blessed, there is such a richness to what he is saying there. In a theology dictionary, these words were given to what blessing means. That which is blessed functions and produces at the optimum level, fulfilling its divinely designated purpose. You see, when God blesses something, he is unlocking it to be the best, the most enjoyable, the optimum, the fullness of all that he desires. And so when God blesses the seventh day, we are told that in the seventh day are rich gifts. In fact, I'm going to identify 3 gifts that God blesses us with when we rest before him on the seventh day. The first I want you to see is that we are recharged. We are recharged. God knows that his image bearers are not like him. They do get tired. They do need time to stop and to let their energy recharge. And so in the Sabbath day, in giving us the Sabbath day, God has set a limit so that our body does not wear itself out, so that our impulse to work does not destroy us. He sets a limit where we are required to stop and allow our energy and our enthusiasm and our strength to catch up again. And so God gives us the limit of a day off for our health to recharge. The second gift that God gives us in a Sabbath is the release. The release. When God says you have to take a day off, he is requiring you to take your hand off the wheel of whatever you are responsible for a full day. Why? To discover that he's still in control. That things will be okay when you're not working. To remind you that your Lord is not yourself, it is him who gives you the permission and the prerogative to be released from whatever grind you are in. Some of us can't stop when it comes to work. Some of us just feel like we need to do more. We need to work harder. Some of us, racked with the sense that we don't do a good 40 hours, say, well, then I'm going to work 50 hours, or I'm going to work 60 hours. And the idea that we just need to keep working and working harder it starts driving us. But what it really reveals is that we are not trusting in God's permission to be released from that work. We are in saying, I have to keep working, I can't afford a day off. We are admitting that we think that we are really self-made, that we are really responsible for our own sufficiency, our own success. When we blast past God's call to rest with our own sense that our call to work is bigger and more important, there is a word for that. It's called idolatry. Because you are ultimately saying, my sense of right, my sense of what this day is for, is more authoritative than the one who created it. You are literally putting yourself in God's place when you are determining that you are not yet ready for a day of rest. That God's promise to bless you in this day is not adequate enough to be released from my work. You see, the day of the Sabbath is to help us know these words from Matthew chapter 6, verses 31 to 33. Therefore, do not be anxious, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the Gentiles seek after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them all. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. You see, God is saying you are not being provided for because you're in the rat race. You're being provided for because I love you. You're my child, and I am committed to caring for you. Step out of the wheel and enjoy the rest that your provider says you can have. Sabbath is a witness to God's rule and our trust in it. It is a witness. Think about that chicken company that you can't go to on Sunday. What a powerful witness that they just believe they can take 1/7 of the time off and still be okay. And does God not fill up their line for lunch and dinner? And are they not doing more business than you've ever seen a convenience restaurant do? But they are trusting that they can take the 7th day off, and God is blessing them. God is blessing them. The third thing that God blesses us with is a place to rejoice. The 7th day calls us to enjoy God, to enjoy creation with him, i.e. to worship. As the psalmist says in Psalm 84:10, for a day in your courts is better than 1,000 elsewhere. You see, the God who created us knows that there is a part of you that needs to worship. And if you do not come to worship God, you will worship something else. And if you worship anything but God, you will make yourself smaller and lesser. And the joy in your life won't last. So God said, I am going to give your heart the maximum infusion of joy by making sure that once a week you have full access to enjoying your Creator, to seeing all of his goodness, to basking fully in his blessing. You see, God-centered rest places us in our Maker's hands, who gives us what we need. So when you come to your day off, do you come to it God-centered? Or do you come to it me-centered? God has offered you such a beautiful day. Let us not lose it to our own idolatry. Third, time is given to worship. God doesn't only bless this day, God makes this day holy. It is a holy day. And holy means that God has set it apart, has made it special, has distinguished it from all other days. What makes this seventh day holy? What makes it special? Well, it's told to us in the seventh day. It is because that is the day where God rests. That is the day where God dwells, where God is seated, where God is in all of his fullness. The seventh day is the day that is holy because on that day, God fills it. And so the seventh day has a special purpose. It is the purpose of worship. Again, Dan Allender comments on this. He says, Sabbath remembers creation and anticipates recreation. It is an eschatological event that prefigures a sin-free, glory-bound world. You see, when you come into the Sabbath, into the holiness of the Sabbath, you taste in the present this great vision that God has for this world to once again be sin-free and filled with his glory. Now, the fascinating thing as you read the seventh day is that it does not have a refrain. All the previous 6 days come to an end with the phrase, and there was evening, and there was morning the first day, or the second day, or the third day. But when you read the seventh day, we never hear the words that evening came. And I think that that is significant. I don't think that the writer that was following God in this place just left it out. There is a reason that there is no refrain. The creation is done. God's work is finished. And by that fact, his rest never ends. The Sabbath of God has no sunset because there's no Monday coming for the Creator. Everything is finished. And so God's rest never ends. There is no sunset to his Sabbath. And the author of Hebrews picks this up as a recognition that the seventh day is not just 1 out of 7 on our calendar, but it is also a placeholder to call us to the eternal fellowship with God. There is an invitation to worship God in his space and in his time in the seventh day. It is an invitation because it says there is no evening and there is no morning to experience with God his joy for all eternity. Look at Hebrews with me, which talks about this instance that does not have this day end. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 4 says, "For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works." And then in verse 6 it says, "It remains, this day remains for some to enter it." There is an invitation into the seventh day, which is the eternal bliss of God. How do we respond to this invitation? How do we respond to this open invitation of enjoying God on this seventh day? Hebrews 4:10 says this to us: "Whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his." That's the invitation. To be part of God's rest, all you have to do is what God did and rest from all your works. You have to complete your image bearing of resting from completing all of your works that were given for you to do. Well, what does that mean? You have to fulfill the call of bearing God's image. You have to fulfill the call of doing work that is God-centered, that is quality and integrity. You have to complete your work in a sense that is free from idolatry. We just have to finish our works. That's all that stands between us and this bliss. But our works are not finished. Our works are unfinished, and they're not very good, right? We are time thieves. We are Sabbath breakers. We are idlers and idolaters. Our time, which was made to be God-centered, has repeatedly become self-centered. And so this invitation to come into God's presence when our works are finished is something that we have disqualified ourselves from. We have nothing that is finished and very good. All we have to God who created time is a testimony of rebellion against his lordship. And so what does Hebrews say to those who rebel? Hebrews 3:11 says, "As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." We cannot say those words are about someone else, because we have failed the stewardship of the time that was given to us without exception. We stand disqualified from God's rest. I mean, what an impossible demand. Who can possibly fulfill the time given to them? Who can possibly finish their works and enter into God's rest? There is only one. There is only one who qualifies for God's rest. There is only one whose works have heard from the heavens, "I am well pleased." There is only one who could say with his final breath, "It is finished." There is only one who has entered heaven to find a chair for him to sit on, so that he could be seated at the right hand of God. There is only one who has been able to enter the rest that God has offered at the beginning of creation, and it is God's Son, Jesus Christ. But here is the good news for all of us who have fallen short of very good work and who have idolized ourselves rather than live for the Lord of the Sabbath. Christ has renewed this invitation of rest. Christ came, and having fulfilled all that we lack, spoke this word to us: "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Come to me, all you who have not finished your work. Come to me, all you who have not done a very good job. Come to me, all you who have wasted your time. Come to me, all you who know you are unworthy of rest. Come to me, and I will give you rest. Because I have fulfilled the very good. I have fulfilled the it is finished. And I have fulfilled the resting place next to God." Trust in Christ, and you enter his Sabbath. We are not called to earn it, but to receive it by faith. So have you come to him? Have you trusted in this offer? Have you allowed him to take the burdens and all your disqualifications off of your shoulders and show you he has fulfilled them and he gives you rest? Beloved, come to him and let the testimony of all your days of work and all your days of Sabbath be, Jesus is my resting place. Amen?